So here we are, session 6 of the Prelude to Enlightenment. And this one I've called Pluralism, Toleration, and the Revival of Humanism. What I aim to do in the last section of this class is talk about the countercurrents or the thinking that was spawned in the 17th century that went against the grain that we've been addressing all of this time. The grain, or the main current, being the development of scientific thinking and mathematical thinking and rationalism in general, and empirical science along with it. And we'll see how there's a reaction to this in certain quarters, but we'll get there when we get there. First of all, I'd like to start talking about the legacy of 16th century religion on the 17th century and the political realities of the 17th century, particularly the tremendous amount of fallout that was generated by the Reformation. So it left the Protestant Reformation left the map of Europe with a patchwork quilt of religious sectarianism. There were a series of religious wars, political wars with religious overtones, outright civil wars, peasant rebellions, and all of these employed extraordinary sectarian violence, the sort of thing that we're not used to in the modern world, but which were quite in evidence in the 17th century. So the wars in the German-speaking countries, the fragmented Holy Roman Empire, among the Catholics on one hand, the so-called magisterial Protestants, meaning the Protestants like Luther, who still argued for a kind of a church hierarchy and bishops, people in a leadership position, and the so-called radical Protestants, the levelers, the ones who wanted to establish fellowships and do away with people in any political authority within the framework of religion or the church. And consequently, the Holy Roman Empire saw the so-called Knights' Revolt, the German Peasants' War, the brutal siege of Münster, which the city was practically, after the siege, burnt to the ground. You had the French wars of religion between Catholics and the Protestant Huguenots, with the famous, or infamous, as they say here, assassination, bloodbath, the frenzy of St. Bartholomew's massacre. And I show you the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in an artistic rendering of it from the late 16th century in the lower left over here. But then there was the English Civil War itself, with its, besides the various episodes of bloodletting, the particular regicide, the assassination of Charles I, and the very strong, recognizable whiff of class warfare. And I show you a plate. Jacques Callot had a series of plates about the miseries of war in the 17th century. This is one of something like 11 plates simply called The Hanging. And it's the kind of mass execution that you would find in 17th century religious warfare. The 30 Years' War, of which this plate is an example, was a continental war that became a great powers war. I've mentioned this before, and which the alignment of major countries, which was going to hold true through the 19th century into the 20th century and bequeath on us the rivalries that began the wars of the 20th century. The 30 Years' War, though, counted upwards of 8 million deaths, putting it in an extraordinary league in this period, including, by the way, 20% estimated of the population of the German-speaking countries, which I hear called Germany, but an unit Germany didn't exist at the time. So there was, if you will, a forced religious pluralism. And just de facto, people started converting. People tend to migrate to like-minded people. And so you would have whole communities dotting the map that didn't belong to the dominant religion of that polity, of that country, of that region, of that state. And the maps below, on the one on the lower left, sort of the map of Europe, those little letters, if you look at the legend on the left, the little letters where you see L's and C's and A's and R's, those are Lutheran, Calvinists, Anabaptists, and Roman Catholics. And the letters are against a color code of the dominant religion. So the green area would be Catholic, but you can see how there are these pockets everywhere of Lutherans or of Calvinists. In France, the Calvinists are the Huguenots. In England, it's Anglican with pockets of Roman Catholics and pockets of Anabaptists. Low church, the Anabaptists are low church radical Protestants. Even in Ireland, you're going to find Calvinist groups hither and yon. In Scotland, which is largely Presbyterian, meaning Calvinist, there are in the Highlands, of course, there are Roman Catholics all over the place. And then on the map on the lower right, which is a religious map of the Holy Roman Empire in 1618, at the point of the outbreak of the 30 Years' War. And you can see just by I'll zoom in here a little bit, the elaborate shadings and color codings and layerings. Those stripes mean that there's some of this and some of that going on. And it's a hodgepodge. And the reason I make a point of this is that in Europe, particularly in continental Europe, a set of practical compromises had to be made to stop the bloodletting. This wasn't a choice, exactly. It was sort of forced on the powers that be if they wanted to achieve any measure of stability, of political stability, given the fact that people were fragmented by religion, and religion is a powerful motive. It's got to do with what people essentially think their lives and destinies are about. So these practical arrangements unfold through the late 16th and through the 17th century. And one of them, I mentioned the first bullet on the page, is the cuius regio eius religio, which means whose realm their religion. And it was a legal compromise in the German states. And remember, there were all, if you number the fragmented German states right down to the smallest unit, there's something like 150 of them in German-speaking lands. And basically the compromise was whatever the religion of the prince of that place is, or the bishop, the prince bishop, as the case may be, of the leader in that unit is, that's going to be the religion, the state religion of that unit. And a sorting system developed out of it so that people selectively migrated from one little place to the other little place to be among the like-minded people. So that by the time you get closer to the 19th century, you tend to have segregated regions in Germany that are either all Catholic or all Lutheran or all Zwinglian or whatever. So in the German countries, that was the practical arrangement. In France, the practical arrangement was the Edict of Nantes, which granted toleration to the Huguenots, to the Protestants in 1598. This will later be rescinded, revoked by Louis XIV in the late 17th century for all sorts of other political reasons. But at this point in time, again, to stop the bloodletting, arrangements were made. And in England, in 1689, after the Civil War, after the restoration of the Stuarts was about to give way to the reforming Protestant king, William of Orange, who's being invited from Holland, freedom of worship is granted through the Toleration Act of 1689 to dissenters. Toleration Act, not that anybody wanted to tolerate, but it meant the avoidance of trouble. So there was a Toleration Act, by the way, which did not extend to Roman Catholics, who don't get fully recognized in England or the United Kingdom until well into the 19th century. So religious pluralism is this de facto circumstance that the political world has to make its way through. And I say in that first upper bullet on this slide that the desire for freedom to worship on the part of religious minorities, we came here to worship as we choose, was countered by a traditional assumption that was very strongly felt that political security and order, law and order, required the oversight of officially established churches. Now you wind up, as a result of this, with the weird case of the American colonies. So now you've got Europeans coming from Holland, coming from England, and if you extend to the very far north and from France, of all kinds of religious faiths, and settling into a region that had not been previously settled by Europeans. There were Native Americans who were considered displaceable by the new arrivals. And the strange case, when I call it a strange case in the American colonies, not only are people settling in cheek by jowl next to each other when they may be of different religions, but there's also the circumstance that they are on the edge of wilderness. And the assumption being that, well, if you don't like it here, and if you feel put upon here, just move a little further inland. Remember, the West was the Delaware Water Gap at this point in time. You could just move on. So there had always been that grand American solution to move on, to get out of the way. And you didn't have the centripetal pressure keeping people together in the same place that you had in Switzerland, that you had in Germany, where there was no other place for anybody to go. And so bloodbaths were the result. The intention of certain migrant groups that came to the Americas was not just to attain religious independence. So the so-called separatists of Puritan New England who came, first they leave England right around, in fact, before the Civil War which began in 1640 in England. They figured there's no place for them, they're not being tolerated, and many of them went to Holland. And then they make their way from Holland over to Plymouth Colony, for instance, or Massachusetts Bay Colony, in 1620. But they did not come just to attain religious independence. They came to create a theocratic state of their own. The idea was, let's go to a place that is ours, where we call the shots and where we can enforce correct confessional thinking. We can enforce a creed. We can be the established church and enforce orthodoxy on our terms, to the point that, for instance, in Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it isn't that this was rife, but it shows you what some of the attitudes were. Between 1659 and 1661, 4 Quaker missionaries who came to preach in Massachusetts Bay Colony were put to death. They had been warned, stay out, we don't want this. But, faith is a strong motivator, and in came the Quakers, and they were hung. 9 of the original 13 colonies had established churches. And those churches had requirements for church attendance. The practical unenforceability of that, though, the unenforceability, as I say here, of total control, obliged nearly all of them to permit some level of religious nonconformity. So again, de facto, the American tradition that likes to celebrate religious tolerance was something that was developed by force. They could not control the influx of people, the variability of religious faiths that were moving in, the diversity of religious faith. And in some places, like New Amsterdam, remember Holland was the great liberal republic of all of Europe in the mid 17th century. So New Amsterdam became the center for anybody who came, who wanted to come. They were coming from England, they were coming from Holland. You had Sephardic Jews, you had nonconformists, you had people with sort of Anglican and Roman Catholic sensibilities moving in, and New Amsterdam, AKA New York, became this, even then, this kind of cosmopolitan center that was not identified with one religion, one ethnicity, one church. Only William Penn, the Quaker of Pennsylvania, only William Penn's Charter of Privileges overtly specified religious freedom. It actually said everybody's going to be free to do what they need to do here, except the Jews, for Christians, and except Muslims, I'm assuming. I don't think they saw that as much of an issue, but it was Christian-centric. But it was the early adoption of what we would think of as a liberal position on toleration, and the reason I'm making a great point of all this is that and it's what I'm going to turn to next, when political theory catches up to this as an ideal, when political theory starts looking at ways of organizing society that do not enforce religious establishment on the citizens, you're moving directly towards, and it will be articulated, directly towards a theory of the separation of church and state. And I mentioned in the box at the bottom here that among 17th century believers, religious tolerance was largely a necessity, not a value. And if I blow up this map a little bit, again, you see in fact, I'm more interested here in the legend than I am in the actual map. People coming to the Americas. There's Anglicans, Puritans, Baptists, Quakers, Presbyterians, German Reform, Dutch Reform, Swedish Lutheran, Roman Catholic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the establishment patterns that you can see, depending, usually following the ethnic settlements. So if you look in the hills of West Virginia, you see Presbyterian, that striped orange thing. That's because that was Scotch-Irish coming to settle those areas, which is why we get the kind of country music that we have in those places and why people do that clog dancing down there, just like they were back home. Anyhow, toleration and political theory. And first person I mentioned is Pierre Bell, a fascinating figure whose lifespan is almost entirely in the 17th century. A brilliant, enigmatic character. He's a philosopher, he's a cultural commentator. He writes this Dictionnaire historique et critique in 1697, which becomes maybe the most widely read book of the 18th century, later, the century that follows, and was read by every Enlightenment figure. It's an encyclopedia of biographies, but he uses it to make comments on religious thought. He's largely a skeptic. He's actually an Huguenot himself, but he's often accused of being an atheist. He's something of an intellectual relativist who starts asking whether any religious faith is worth the political and violent outcomes that are often tied to it. And he becomes a defender of the principle of religious toleration early on. He argues in this first bullet here that in the case of an erring conscience, so you're convinced of one thing, and here's somebody else who's a true believer of another format. And he says, in that case, you're both true believers. Constraint, force is never justified, even if it's in the best interest of the person in error. Even if you know you are right, it's not going to have the desired outcome. It is thus tolerance that in the source of peace and intolerance that is the source of disorder. There was no other God, religion, or lawful magistracy other than conscience, which teaches all men the precepts of justice, to do no injury, to live honestly, and to give everyone his due. Leave them to their moral consciences and get out of the way, essentially, because the alternative is to foster violence of one kind or another. Toleration is rooted in skepticism and relativism. The largest arguments that can be made in defense of toleration is how sure can you be of what you think is the correct thing. They'll claim to be a believer, but he made such a case for atheism that many Enlightenment and modern thinkers came to think of him as just putting one over on the establishment, having them on, pulling their leg. And he says, do you doubt that the least effects of nature were not used as marks of the wrath of heaven? Like when anything went wrong in nature, look at the way it got used by religious authorities. It was to the interest of pontiffs, priests, and augurs. No wonder they took care that the people should not grow slack in their religion. So anything that goes bad in society, we just blame it on the anger of the gods as a proof of our position. It has been asserted that a moral atheist would be a monster beyond the power of nature to create. I reply that it is not more strange for an atheist to live virtuously than for a Christian to abandon himself to crime. If we believe the last kind of monster, why dispute the existence of the first kind? And so you begin to have, in the late 17th century, a positive theory of toleration, as opposed to that kind of passive, we have to live with this, it's not desirable, we have to live with it because of the religious pluralism we find all over the place. Here, they're now establishing, thinkers have decided to make the best of a bad thing, make a positive out of the bad thing, a positive theory of toleration. And it's born out of this sobriety that skepticism and relativism engender. And our friend John Locke, yet again, he pops up everywhere, does he not? Which is why the 18th century thought he was a god. In 1689, he seemed to have published virtually everything in 1688 and 1689. He was a busy boy. He published a letter concerning toleration, is the name of it, which argues that the toleration of religious groups actually prevents civil unrest. He takes Bale just a step further. Confrontations are the result of civil authorities attempting to impose religious control. Nobody, therefore, neither single persons nor churches, nay, nor even commonwealths, have any just title to invade the civil rights and worldly goods of each other upon pretense of religion. You have no right. Those that are of another opinion would do well to consider with themselves how pernicious a seed of discord and war, how powerful a provocation to endless hatreds, rapines, and slaughters they thereby furnish unto mankind. And then he moves straight into an argument that for the separation of church and state. At first, Locke makes the commonplace observations about religious belief coming from internal conviction, the conversio morum, the turning of the soul, the reform of the soul, and not external force. And so he makes that case. But the heart of his argument concerns the limits of civil government and the separation of church and commonwealth, or what we call church and state. It is not the diversity of opinions which cannot be avoided, but the refusal of toleration to those that are of different opinions, which might have been granted, that has produced all the bustles and wars that have been in the Christian world upon account of religion. The heads and leaders of the church, moved by avarice and insatiable desire of dominion, making use of a moderate ambition of magistrates and the credulous superstition of the giddy multitude. I think we're now in an age of the giddy multitude, are we not? Have incensed and animated them against those that dissent from themselves by preaching unto them contrary to the laws of the gospel and to the precepts of charity. That schismatics and heretics are to be outed of their possessions and destroyed. And thus have they mixed together and confounded two things that are themselves most different, that are in themselves most different, the church and the commonwealth, that should be kept apart. So, religious toleration as a positive political theory. And moving to another argument that opened the European mind in our period was the anticipation of what would later on become a serious science of cultural relativism, and the fields of ethnography and cultural anthropology, if you will. The Reformation introduced Christian pluralism, but expanded trade, and the missionary ventures introduced pluralism of another kind. So suddenly there are contacts with civilizations in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. And these forced European intellectuals to consider the full variety of social organization and its implications for human nature. So travel literature, for instance, this becomes a heyday and will for the next century and a half, from the 1660s all the way, even to the 1850s. I mean, for the next couple of centuries, travel literature that romanticizes foreignness and differentness becomes a fad, but certainly all the way through the 18th century. This is the period in which people started like collecting chinoiserie and things like that. So the earliest theories of what we would call cultural anthropology were really products of the 18th century Enlightenment, particularly led by the Scottish Enlightenment, led by the figures of William Robertson and Adam Ferguson, writers who really start looking at cultures comparatively. They start writing about comparative anthropological study, how this society organizes itself and whether it's similar to others or different than ours, and what this might mean and what it suggests for human nature, of course. Because if things are only culturally diverse, and we could be that had we been born in another time and place, what does this say about the plasticity of human nature? But all of those developments in the 18th century were built on this foundation that was established by 17th century philosophers and missionaries who promoted these kinds of ethnographic studies. And I show on the bottom, there's a Japanese, this wonderful Japanese screen of a Portuguese ship. It was unsigned, the maker's unknown. It's in the Victoria and Albert in London. It was probably done in the period between 1600 and 1630. And it's a Portuguese ship coming into port, and I can't get enough of a close-up, but you get these interesting locals greeting it here, and it's just a wonderful thing. And of course, this is actually in Rome. I believe this is in the Vatican somewhere. It's the samurai Hazakura Tsunanaga, and who came to Rome, brought by the Jesuit missionaries and in full regalia. And here he is in 1615, being painted by Orchita Ricci, suggesting and both of these suggesting that this other that they find in Asia, whether in both cases in Japan in this case, but it was earlier in China, the first inroads, that these are mature civilizations, and it would be found later on in many areas in India just as well, not to mention some of the island places, but that these are mature civilizations with dramatically deep traditions of history of their own, often with fairly mature science of their own, especially in China, and mathematics, and the idea that Europeans were entirely unique is questioned by these discoveries, which will feed into the kinds of social thinking that will develop in the Enlightenment in the 18th century. The use of the state of nature by people like Hobbes and Locke to hypothesize what people would do in forming complex political societies and ultimately government in a state of nature, as they like to call it. This convention was strongly developed by European contact with tribal societies in the Americas and in Africa. So all the questions of sovereignty and rights and the origins of society, they could look back to what they regarded as a simpler way of living and look to as kind of laboratory model of what might be expected by human nature in that circumstance. So it was in this period that Europeans developed the range of opinions that described indigenous peoples as, the noble savage, for instance, tradition, or primitive. So in some cases, it was a derogatory view of native tribal cultures. And in some cases, there was a sense of romanticized nobility. But when we get to, in the mid to late 18th century, people like Rousseau, primitive societies are going to be romanticized as superior, as less corrupt, as less deviant, that the worship of property has destroyed the human soul for people like Rousseau. We have on the bottom left, Kuna Indians, a new voyage and description of the Isthmus of America by a Welsh buccaneer, a pirate, who was, interestingly enough, someone who took great interest in the societies that he found on his way around the world. I believe he actually went to places that Captain Cook would visit later on in the 18th century. And on the right, a drawing of a 23-year-old Algonquian man by Wenceslas Holler in 1645. And again, done with respect for a sense of difference. And you would find this is very common, and people loved accounts of this kind of stuff. People were always writing stories of my time in the Indies and what I found when I went there. And of course, the myths of golden cities in South America would proliferate through European literature for the next 100 years after this. Anyhow, I want to start talking about the traditions that come out of the 17th century in two formats. One is what I will speak of as the dominant currents, and the others being the countercurrents or the objections made to them. The main party line, the current, if you will, is what I called here the God in the machine. So, and it's what most of this course was devoted to, the great scientific and mathematical breakthroughs of the 17th century led many to the idea that everything, including humans, was fundamentally a mechanism that obeyed universal laws. And began to suggest we are animals like other animals. We follow the rules of nature, the laws of nature, as does everything else. Science, rationalism, and determinism. Machines are determined. They do what they have to do. Once universal laws were properly understood, and it was assumed was only going to be a matter of time, mankind would have unimaginable control. The way forward, the method, was the scientific rationalism that had achieved all these breakthroughs in the 17th century. And it seemed like the wildest dreams of the alchemists, of the earlier alchemists, would be in reach. It was going to be as I call it, a couple bullets below this, a brave new world. Deism, the form of religion that came to dominate the Enlightenment figures of the next century, was a form of religion that has been filtered through a rationalist lens. So Deism, as I say here, the dominant religion of 18th century intellectuals, if you call it that, believed in a creator God, a clockmaker God, if you will, who created the great workings of the great clock called the universe and set it running according to the laws of nature, and then walked away, in effect. So that we look at the universe, we see order, we see the great machine running, and we say, there must be a story behind this, a set of principles, if you will. And many people in the century were tempted towards some form or other of pantheism, thinking that God was the order implicit in the actual universe, but that the scriptural God, the gods of the Testaments, the gods of the Quran, was a set of primitive fables, the scriptures of one kind or another, for barely literate tribal societies. And the assumption was, well, thought had evolved. We're not riding around on camels in the desert anymore, needing simple narrative stories to try to cope with an understanding of nature. We've moved from mythopoetic religious thinking to analytic, scientific, mathematically precise thinking. And our idea of God should evolve accordingly. So he isn't a big brother or big sister that you talk to. Basically, if you want to communicate with God, you study the workings of the universe. And for these people, it is the brave new world. A sense of optimism and progress is rooted in all of the scientific and technological success. And this pervaded what came to be known in the next century as Enlightenment. They were so sure that this was the right path. Human enlightenment doesn't mean we had this moment of clarity. It means we've moved to a new stage for these folk. It's an enlightenment. Somebody turned the light on. It's the siècle des Lumières. It is the Aufklärung. The lights have gone on, never to be put out again. This was to be the golden age of human activity, onward and upward, excelsior, as the motto of New York State, I believe. It is the new classicism. It's the new rational calmness with which we approach the universe. Now, this is what I'm suggesting is the current, the dominant intellectual response that grew through the 17th century and reached its acme, its high point in the Enlightenment of the mid to late 18th century. Rationalism, scientism, deism, optimistically regarding a human movement from the primitive to a higher form. It is a classicism that thinks of, I want you to think about the way this word I'm about to use has morphed in meaning for these people with this sense of progress and the sense of having made it up out of the muck into the higher realm. The word artifice spoke of art. Artifice and artificial were not derogatory. Artificial was an improvement over the natural. It was taking something that was raw and making it cooked. It was something unformed and giving it finesse. Just in many ways, the reverse of how we might think of using the term now. But, and the box at the bottom, but by the late 17th century, counter narratives have developed that objected to the new rationalism as being overly reductive, leading to woefully oversimplified views of human nature and history. And these became the first expressions of what will be called later on 18th century Romanticism, and a slightly more technical term that I'll try to make some sense of later on for you, organicism. That this machine-like sense of how things work is an oversimplification that the human mind and human nature and all of nature actually defy. The ecosystem is more complicated than your idea of the ecosystem, as we'll see. Anyhow, one of the objectors, if you will, one of the countercurrents is an interesting figure, Anthony Ashley Cooper, the third Earl of Shaftesbury, usually referred to as Shaftesbury. By the way, he's the third Earl, so there were two previous. We are now in the 21st century up to something like the 12th Earl, and they're all named Anthony Ashley Cooper. So when you use the name, you got to sort of mention which one you're talking about. They're not all philosophers. I think the more recent ones are like collectors of foreign cars, but this one had quite a footprint on the 18th century, and he lives not a long life. He's born in 1671, and he dies by 1713. He's a moralist, and he stands as a philosopher in opposition to what he thinks of as the crass depiction of human nature and Thomas Hobbes. The life of man, nasty, brutish, and short. He's an important figure in the 18th and 19th centuries. His theory is essentially that there is an innate moral sense built in to the human mind or soul. He argued that humans are designed with an innate sense of order and harmony, which when used with reason, with the application of reason, will produce proper aesthetic, moral, and religious decisions. Human morality, as he sees it, is the result of a rational affection. And the way they use the term affection in this period is close to what we would use the word emotion or sentiment for. Human reason coupled with a sentiment that is built into the fabric of human nature. So, a quote from him: "Sense of right and wrong, therefore being as natural to us as natural affection itself, and being a first principle in our constitution and our makeup. There's no speculative opinion, persuasion, or belief. In other words, there's no rational argument which is capable immediately or directly to exclude or destroy it. And this affection being an original one of earliest rise in the soul or affectionate part, the emotional part of the human constitution, nothing besides a contrary affection, an opposing one, by frequent check and control can operate upon it, so as either to diminish it in part or destroy it in the whole." So we have these built-in emotional dispositions that he is going to argue are ineluctable. They drive human motivation. And I say in the very next bullet, morality is rooted in affection because only emotions can motivate. David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher of the 18th century, later characterized reason as, in his terms, he didn't use this exact phrase, but as motivationally inert, that human reason doesn't make you want anything, that it's other elements born into the human personality that do. And because of this whole idea of them being built in and being innate, he is something of a Platonist. And we see in that picture of the right, it's a painting of Shaftesbury and his brother as Neoplatonists. There was a group at Cambridge in this period, slightly earlier, slightly older than Ashley Cooper, who were called the Cambridge Platonists. And they may have influenced him, but we don't, the jury's sort of out on that. Virtue, as he says, is really something in itself. Virtue is something in itself. This is going to sound very like Plato. The good is something in itself and in the nature of things. It's not arbitrary or factitious, meaning it's not something that just serves your appetite at the moment. It's not constituted from without or dependent on custom, fancy, or will, not even on the supreme will, not even God itself, which can no way govern it. But being necessarily good is governed by it and ever uniform with it. Whoop, there we go. Now, who's he writing in opposition to? Well, obviously Hobbes. The moral sense, or a theory of the moral sense, is going to be in the 18th century and had been as early as Plato, always opposed to arguments from self-interest. So the question is, when do humans do what is in their, as they see it at any given point in time, in the rational self-interest, or are they motivated to do something that is good in and of itself? And is there anything that is good in and of itself? Or is what we call good merely the product of narrow self-interest? Now, for Hobbes, there was no moral sense governing human nature. You're in a state of nature, you want to stay alive, that's it. That's the dictate. And so you form civil society so that people won't kill each other. The stark choices in the state of nature came down to a simple calculation of self-interest. John Locke finessed that a little bit. He allowed for moral rules in the state of nature, but the chance to join the social contract was about property. Remember, we just talked about it last class. And property is the essential, quintessential expression of self-interest. I got my stuff. I want to protect my stuff. So I'll join the club. A contemporary of Shaftesbury, a man named Bernard Mandeville, who was Anglo-Dutch, he lived in both countries. And he's born in 1670. He lives a little longer, but he's born in 1670, so he's very close in age. He publishes a very famous and influential essay called The Fable of the Bees, or Private Vices, Public Benefits. And the Fable of the Bees is essentially, bees all go about their private business, collecting honey, doing this, doing that. But the hive, the social good that benefits, is the result of all of them going about their private business. And he likens human society to that people pursuing their interests in the greater marketplace, their, if you will, their private vices, yield a public good. The society benefits by people trying to beat each other to the punch. trying to outcompete each other, that the conclusion of competitive vices is public virtue, the greater good of the whole. So he argues that the greatest social good derives from individual human vice. People selfishly and competitively pursuing profit created a market that benefited society as a whole. This was what we called last week possessive individualism at its crassest. So we have Shaftesbury wanting to make the case, though, and he does it in a work called Inquiry Concerning Virtue and Merit, argues that virtue in its purest sense is in the individual's self-interest. You will be a better person by pursuing virtue. He sounds like the character Socrates in all of the Platonic dialogues here. That to yield or consent to anything ill or immoral is a breach of interest. It's not your interest to be immoral, and leads to the greatest ills. That on the other side, everything which is an improvement of virtue or an establishment of right affection and integrity is an advancement of interest and leads to the greatest and most solid happiness and enjoyment. So where does this thinking, which in his case is very much an echo of Platonism, where does this thinking lead in the 18th century? In a very interesting direction. Three, what I call here, pillars of the Scottish Enlightenment: Francis Hutcheson, David Hume, and Adam Smith. They, all three famous for writing about human ethics, built their ethics on the foundation of an idea that they call, Hutcheson is the first to use the term, sympathy, a moral sense rooted in the emotions. Hutcheson made the case, and Hume makes a lot of the case, and then Smith follows Hume, that human fellow feeling, what he called sympathy, the regard of whether it's family members, whether it's friends, this fellow feeling, which is the root of a moral sensibility, is built in and will outweigh rational conclusion. That the empathetic feeling of a human to another, as they are closer to you, or, it's stronger; as they're more remote from you, it's lesser. That is so built in that you can't make sense of human ethics and you can't make sense of human politics without starting with it. Not that it is not amenable at all to rational analysis, just that it's got to be one of the factors considered in creating a moral system, an ethical system, a political system. And so it's not just Platonic idealism as a kind of pie in the sky. For these guys, for the Scottish Enlightenment guys, it's a function of the psyche, the human psyche. It's part of the human personality. So the road from Shaftesbury led directly to Hume's An Enquiry Concerning the Principle of Morals, and Adam Smith's great book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, written very late, I think of like 1790 or something like that. And one of the great books of the 18th century, probably as great a book as The Wealth of Nations. And probably founded schools of thinking about human behavior that are quite popular right into the 21st century, because I don't think anybody's trying to make the case for explaining human behavior as a result of rational self-interest calculations, whether it's the stock market or God knows what. Anyhow, and the last thinker of the period I want to look at, and after this, I want to mention a great thinker of the century that I did not include in this course because I didn't know how to do it. I'll talk about that later. But a man you may never have heard of, Giambattista Vico, a Neapolitan, and an extraordinarily clever character, linguist, philologist, historian, rhetorician, jurist, professor at the University of Naples, not known a whole lot outside of Naples in his own period, but becomes a huge influence on the German Romantic tradition of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And he writes his great book, the Scienze Nuove, the New Science. He objects to the Cartesian method because ideas are phenomena that cannot be expressed logically or mathematically, particularly anything to do with the civic, historical, or artistic spheres, are dismissed. If you can't talk about stuff in that world outside the boundaries of logic and mathematics, you don't talk, the Cartesianism doesn't even try to address it. He says, to introduce geometrical method into practical life is like trying to go mad with the rules of reason, attempting to proceed by a straight line among the tortuosities of life, as though human affairs were not ruled by capriciousness, temerity, opportunity, and chance. Similarly, to arrange a political speech according to the precepts of a geometrical method is equivalent to stripping it of any acute remarks and to uttering nothing but pedestrian lines of argument. It's an oversimplification. And a famous line of his Verum esse ipsum factum, which is very loosely translated as the true is what is made, or precisely what is made, in a book of his called On the Most Ancient Wisdom of the Italians Unearthed from the Origins of the Latin Language. He tries to do a cultural assessment of 2,000 years of Italians by doing an analysis of the structure of the Latin language itself. He's an incredibly interesting character. Vico makes the case that truth is verified through creation or invention. Humans make their truths, not through, as the Cartesians would have it, simple observation, that the human act of creation shapes what we take it, it selects out facts, it molds it into a narrative, and he warns people, if you are naive, you think you are being objective. If you are naive. But think about the way you've selected facts and elements to flesh out your story, your narrative, the great human creation of a theory is not just a simple stack of facts. It's a narrative that the complex human mind has constructed around that set of facts. And he argues that civil life, the activity and history of mankind, like mathematics, is wholly constructed out of whole cloth. So he restores ancient and Renaissance humanism as subjects that are to be studied along the side of the new sciences, not as a replacement, but have your Cartesianism, but have this also. And this frontispiece from an early edition of his book, an early 18th century edition of his book, I won't try to go into everything that is represented here, but he sees his whole enterprise symbolically represented by, this is metaphysics, regarding the eye of God. There's a statue of Homer, poetic wisdom, all entering into the books he's going to write at the bottom of the plate. So, just a couple of slides left and a few comments, and then we'll end the whole thing. So, what I called the 18th century currents, it's a cult of rationalism, cult of reasoning, cult of progress. It's characterized by several things. The advances in science and technology are cited as evidence all the time. The invention of the social sciences, economics, and anthropology rooted in, and these are 18th century currents. So I'm moving on a bit. So I'm looking at what the Enlightenment does, that it has pulled out of the sensibility established by the period we've just been studying. So there is science and technology. There are these social sciences being developed. There are all an explosion of theories of constitutionalism and republicanism leading up to France in 1789 and the United States in 1776, but dozens of other reform movements and constitutionalist movements. Designs for reforms in public education, penal systems, and public health all over Europe, and by every nationality. Beccaria, the Swiss penal reformer, Rousseau arguing about educational methods, public health systems being promoted by the court in Vienna, for instance. The development of communication platforms in this period. This is the age of the great broadside newspapers, the penny sheets that anybody could get on a daily basis. And of course, the modern book trade. It was in the 18th century, the first two people ever to be able to make a living through the sale of books without needing patrons or sponsorship of any kind were Sam Johnson and David Hume. David Hume for writing his history of the Stuarts, and Sam Johnson for his dictionary and literary exercises. But it wasn't until really the 1750s that you could, anywhere in Europe, make a living, support yourself in a style that you wanted to be supported in, entirely by the publication, through the publication of books. And its ideal form was measure, classicism, balance, the virtues of the rational. And to pick that up, I have this painting of, it's actually a reading in the Salon of Madame Geoffrin, which is one of the great Parisian salons of the mid-18th century. And this one happened to be actually about a reading of one of the tragedies of Voltaire. So it's being read. It doesn't get published first. This is Paris in the mid-18th century. Who's Who show up, and it is read at the salon, and a who's who is in here of nobles and philosophes and what have you. Everything we think of as 18th century classicism, having proceeded from the breakthroughs in science and mathematics in the 17th century. But the 18th century countercurrents that grow out of the reaction to this sensibility are also strongly realized in the period of the Enlightenment. And that reaction to rationalism and scientism is characterized by, as I say in the lower left, the emphasis on the role of human emotions, on human passion, and on human subjectivity, as opposed to objective science. subjectivity and the molding of the private narrative that you get. This is the age of the great novels first being produced in England and France in the period. And in Germany, Werther's Light and the Sorrows of Young Werther. Goethe writes the book of the young lovers whose love cannot be fulfilled, and they double suicide, and this great romantic emotionalist purge that becomes quite a fashion among the young in the Germany of the 18th century. It's a focus on nature. This is the period in which the natural is thought of as rival, and the organic as rivaling the artificial and the constructed. Focuses on nature and not on the machine. The great romantic painting of the periods between 1770 and 1830 of you think of the Turner paintings and skies and turmoil. I show you one because I picked it because it's early. This painting by Thomas Jones in 1774. It's got nature in the raw, and you get the sense of movement and turmoil and Sturm und Drang, storm and stress, as the Germans would have had it. And you've got a ruin. This is the age of romantic gardens with ruins in the often artificial ruins in the background. It's a period, it's a countercurrent that wants to study historical perspectives, languages, and institutions. It's a period in which ideas of tribal identity and the nation, the term actually gets Nation, gets developed in this period as being the organic group that you truly belong to. It's not this rational conclusion of Lockean or Hobbesian citizens in a state of nature making a rational judgment call about leaving the state of nature and forming a civic society devoid of passion and tribal identity. It's the reverse of that. It's the idea that's not the unit that I belong to. This soulless civic society, as Rousseau thought of the modern world. It is the tribal identity, the familial identity, those close to me, those who I know through the emotion of sympathy, which we know is at the root of our natures, that is the real. And of course, as a result of this, instead of idealizing classical Rome and classical Greece as did the high Enlightenment figures, these folks idealize the medieval with its darkness and overtones of religiosity and overtones of tribal movement and the like. And in the very last slide, we have on the left, I decided just to do a visual contrast in the current and countercurrent movements of the period. On the left, we have the passion in the 17th and 18th century for classical gardens, the Orangerie at Versailles, the gardens at the Neapolitan Royal Palace at Caserta, and the huge building that is the Royal Palace of Caserta, and the romantic English gardens, Stourhead in Wiltshire, which I have visited, by the way, quite a lovely place to stroll through. With, of course, as any romantic garden worth its its thunder, you have old buildings just decoratively ornamenting the countryside. And here you have nature, refined nature, the Olmsted parks are these, and the capability brown parks of the Romantic period in England are constructed with great artifice, but to look natural and to look like they just organically happen that way, to feature the strengths of nature. And here's Nyman's in Sussex, one of the Sussex gardens. And again, by the way, these medieval ruins were often actually constructed as medieval ruins. They never were there. They were made just to add a touch of romance to the place. And so we've reached the end. And here was a course about the rise of science and the rise of the new methodologies and its application to political theory and new ways of thinking about government and property, but which fostered reaction, even in its own time, and developed into two of the wings that we find of the late 18th century, a sense, a belief in, and a hope in progress and rational discourse and and equanimity and world peace and a future articulated by rational models. And on the other hand, a vision of the passions deeply rooted in the human soul, and later on the cult of art that's going to grow out of the Romantic vision itself. Anyhow, the figure I said I would have put in this course, and maybe the most interesting mind of the entire 17th century, is the great Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza, the Dutch Jew who's excommunicated from his congregation. He's a Sephardic Jew because of his very complex philosophical, maybe pantheism, is what he's often accused of by the critics. And I would have used him, but he stands out as being so idiosyncratic and so unlike anybody else in the period. I didn't know how to group him. I mean, he's worth a study on his own, and he influences some very rarefied philosophical mainstream thinkers in later periods, but he's hard to put under the glass. So I left him out. Anyhow, you can't do it all. But with that, I will stop the share. I will unpin myself. And if there are questions or comments, I will mention what I'm going to do beginning in February. The very first course that I did for the Miele program when we were in person in the library was a 4-session peek at the classical Greek 5th century BC, in which the development of the foundations of European thought, from mythic thinking to a new way of regarding the world, was developed. And I want to redo that now in 6 sessions with all sorts of added things in. And so that's what, and I know a lot of you here now are not people who sat through that. So I apologize to anybody that did, but there is still going to be new stuff. And I will make sure they send the flyer around and let you know what it's going to be. outside of that, any questions or comments on this class or?
Lou, living in South Carolina, I feel that we're still in the 17th and 18th century. And
You're still
that
having
we are in still the prelude.
you're still having your religious wars, huh?
Well, it's funny. When I moved down here, there's such a strong Scotch-Irish influence and puritanical. The Baptists actually accepted the Jews because they were the people of the old book, and they revered. The Catholics down here for a long time were persona non grata. I mean, that's where Stephen Colbert grew up as a Catholic, by the way. Right. I mean, it's changing. I mean, I'm a Jerseyite. I'm down here 12 years. I don't have an accent yet, but there is a tremendous influx into Charlotte and then spilling into South Carolina of Northerners and Westerners and whatnot, and the philosophies are changing. But there's still a religious right here that doesn't believe in separation of church and state. And we're still fighting issues. It's amazing. It really is amazing.
I don't doubt it.
You know, I always like to listen to your class and try and identify, today's society with it and how does it affect it. And it's amazing. It's just incredible.
Lou, when you were talking about the religious wars, I was thinking of what the Taliban is doing today and the Shining Path previously, and how you remarked that the only way to stop the killing was to embrace tolerance. But I don't know if it's going to take another 400 years for that to happen.
It happens in different places in different ways, if it happens at all. Anyhow, this is very nice.
Bravo.
I think this was a marvelous course, Lou. Congratulations, and I personally got a whole lot out of it.
Thank you. I'm going to send, of course, when they post it, I'm going to send the link to this class and ask him to organize the 6 into a playlist. And what I will, because I know I get some new people each term, everything that's been done, that I've done on YouTube has been organized into playlists on the Montclair YouTube site. And I'll send an email that carries all of the playlists. So if anybody wanted to amuse themselves on a rainy day with any of the old classes. Also, I will send out the full slide presentation as PDF for this whole course, which is, it's about 90 slides or something like that, as soon as I get it together. Anyhow, it's been fun. And if you're around, I will see you in February, if anybody wants to join in then. Anyhow.
Thank you, Lou.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you, Lou.
Take care, gang.
Lou, I hope it's on virtual as well. Maybe you have face-to-face, but I'd still like it virtual.
I think it'll be.
Yeah.
I think it'll be either virtual or both.
Both? Okay.
Okay?
Great.
Take care.
Look forward to February.